Hello and welcome everyone. I'm joined here with Matt, aka Warchamp on Letterbox. Today we're here to discuss Sidney Lumet, one of the most prolific TV to movie directors, and we are covering two of his legal dramas, his infamous, or not infamous, but very famous, well regarded 12 Angry Men and The Verdict. Matt, we really discussed this beforehand and was part of the reason we chose these two. You have a background in law, you're in law school currently, and just prior to this conversation, we were kind of talking about how accurate these movies were to actual law. But before we get there, um, do you recall your first Sidney Lumet movie that you watched?
Oh yeah, I think it was Dog Day Afternoon. My dad really liked that movie, and when I started getting more into movies, he kept telling me, this is a movie you should watch. And eventually we watched it together, and I thought it was great.
I not to I don't think this will spoil anything, but I think that was one of the first Lumet movies I watched as well. I did recall in high school over the course of like maybe two or three classes, I did watch 12 Angry Men originally, and that's almost coming up on 10 years now. But the first one that I really sat down watched on my own was Dog Day Afternoon, and Lumet has a couple of movies with Al Pacino that I think he really utilized the talents that Pacino can bring to the screen.
Yeah, he was great in Dog Day Afternoon. When I'm thinking of, his roles, or my favorites, I've got to say it's probably Scarface, uh, Dog Day Afternoon, and another movie called The Insider. I really like him in. I mean, he's great in Serpico, obviously too, but just in terms of my favorites, I think it's those three.
Yeah, and here's another aspect to Sidney Lumet, the director, is you know I think in what we're going to touch upon is that he has with 12 Angry Men arguably one of the best debut films. And on top of that, and I want to get your kind of thoughts on that, Matt. On top of that, he has a career that spanned close to 5 decades, I believe. And the quality, while between each film, varied. But man, his first film and I would argue his last film are really strong beginnings and possible ends to a career. But and that is 12 Angry Men and Before the Devil Knows You're Dead with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Ethan Hawke. But as far as directorial debuts, um, just a loose list. I mean, does this kind of rank amongst the best you've seen?
For his films,
Just all directors, their first films. 12 Angry Men, do you
oh
think it's one of the best debuts?
yeah, I mean, for a debut, like there are some directors where they kind of have that and then they fall off, or
Mm,
but for the most part, it's one of their weaker ones, or it's one where you kind of see like where their style evolved from. Like when you watch their newer movies, you go watch their debut and you kind of see, some similarities. But in my opinion, from all the movies I've seen, I think 12 Angry Men. I mean, I'd say in my mind it's tied with Dog Day Afternoon.
mm.
Um, but like I the movies I've seen for him, I can't look at his later ones and be like, this was way better than 12 Angry Men. I think that might be his best overall, just in my opinion.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you. I believe on like my favorites list, I think Dog Day Afternoon. I think is just a little bit better than 12 Angry Men, and a large part of that is um, Al Pacino is just freaking amazing, and you touched upon that. I think you're dead on the money with that. But in comparison, a couple that I have talked up or that came to my attention as far as debuts, two famous ones that I know of and have seen. Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, and then Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. But I certainly think it's worth mentioning in the same breath that 12 Angry Men deserves to be in that discussion for best debut. And I think, from what I've read and his experience with television, it gave him an upper hand to have some of the technical aspects down pat before he made it to the big screen. And I mean, just throwing it to you, Matt, I don't know for certain, but I would imagine that has to give you some advantages.
Yeah, it's one thing I noticed about I guess all his movies I've seen that's kind of he might do best in 12 Angry Men is the dialogue, how well the script is written. I'm not sure who wrote the script exactly, but it it really is done very well.
It's totally uh you know the personification, or like it feels very fitting within the 50s style of that, rapid fire dialogue for sure, and constantly bouncing between characters, fully utilizing that ensemble cast. And it's a movie that's so dialogue driven that having them able to kind of uphold the pace of the movie is critical, and it's done really, really well.
Yeah, and it's interesting watching. I was thinking it's going to be hard to discuss this movie for one reason, and it's because I'm not going to know how to refer to each cheer member. And I think so many of them are like unique in their own ways and they're interesting, and I want to talk about them. But I'm going to have a hard time referencing which one is which.
Yeah, I mean the jury number. I mean it's nearly impossible to keep track of the numbers. But the thing that I did like is there's a little kind of character trait that seemingly defines each juror for the majority of them, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, and then there's kind of like the two guys, or maybe three, where they're kind of one is really for not guilty and one is guilty, and they you kind of see them stand on each of their own opinions and sides until they kind of just break each other down.
Yes, and I believe those are, to my knowledge, like the two most famous actors of the bunch. Um, and I'm gonna sound like a bonehead now. The one, his last name is Fonda. I'm pretty certain he married Jane Fonda. Um, does that ring a bell? Do you know the actor's name that I'm talking about, Matt?
Henry Fonda, yeah, because he's in a lot of old school movies that I've seen that I like.
Yes, in and he is like uh, the moral spotlight, and the guy that is very staunchly, well, not even staunchly, but he is very much trying to uphold justice. And the guy who is very strong in his beliefs of guilty, I think, is um, Lee J. Cobb, I think is his name. I know him from, he's the detective in the original Exorcist. Um,
Okay, yeah, yeah. I just pulled him up on Letterbox. He's in this. I remember he's in this movie called On the Waterfront. That's really, really good. I believe he plays one of the gangster characters. So now that I'm, pulled up his profile, I put a face to and remembered him from that film. But yes, I think that you're right that that's him.
so having those kind of two strong leads, and then I would imagine the remainder of the cast. I mean, they're all really solid. I could see them all being really prolific character actors for the 40s and 50s. And speaking to the screenplay, I think I was reading this. It's actually 12 Angry Men is based upon a play, if I recall correctly. And when you look at, in essence, what the film is, it would be perfectly for a play because it's lone setting and all dialogue driven. I mean, you could, easily set that up for Broadway, and it would probably be way less taxing than a lot of other like Broadway plays that you would need costume changes and set changes. This would actually be one of the more simple productions, I would think.
Yeah, and there's another film. I don't Have you ever seen My Dinner with Andre?
I have heard about that, and correct me if I'm wrong. One of the leads is the guy from Princess Bride who says never engage in a land war with China. Um,
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah, that's him.
but yeah, what were you gonna say involving that film?
Oh, I was just gonna say that was the other movie that really stuck out to me as being one where the whole movie is just them talking at dinner and they're having a like really cool, interesting conversation,
Mm,
and it kind of brings you in the same way that 12 Angry Men does. And it's just all because of how they're talking and kind of how it flows is what you would think uh, would be in that movie. It's more about like a intellectual conversation and kind of like deep talking points. And in this one, in 12 Angry Men, it's more engaging because they're bringing up all these doubts and you start to question who's right, and then the whole dialogue just ends up making you uh wonder about, I guess, the process of how they decide guilty or not guilty in general.
absolutely. I This is another movie that my mind went to because I have yet to see My Dinner with Andre yet, but definitely want to, especially after your description. The one that did come to mind is a Hitchcock film in which there are characters kind of leaving and entering the scene, but it kind of has a central location that everything is shot at, and is mostly just dialogue driving everything. Is Rope? Have you seen that film, Matt?
I love that film. I think that's a brilliant movie, and it's like it is like 12 Angry Men in that way. The way I would just distinguish it is that from what I remember about it, I loved the mystery aspect to it. Like there was
Mm,
more, I guess he did more with the setting in terms of stuff you didn't see or you didn't know going on. It was kind of in a way like those murder mysteries.
yes,
A little different, but I guess the twist of what made it different was why I loved that movie so much.
absolutely. Um, the suspense that kept me enthralled with this film was Henry Fonda's character was honest when he said, I don't know. And he actually seemed so open minded that he would sway his opinion, and the staunchness of the people surrounding him and how emboldened in their opinions they were. I can still remember when I first watched this that I wasn't sure if Henry Fonda was going to sway from his opinion, his original opinion. And to nearly the very end, I was kind of interested, even as it started to get past like the split decision point. I thought he seems like such a genuine and honest guy that if there was an argument made, that um he would give away. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And another thing that I found, interesting about his point of view, I guess contrasted with the others, is he was the first one to bring the doubt, I guess, initially. He was the one first doubting it. And it's as if they kind of had to reconstruct the entire trial on their own to end up all doubting it. It's like he's the only one that initially took that had a reasonable doubt, coming from the trial, which I thought was interesting how they were all convinced except him.
And I think what is really surprising, um, decades later, is I do think there's a misconception from people that you don't have to prove your innocence. You have to be proven guilty. This picture perfectly outlines that. But I kid you not. I mean, there's people that I've talked to before, and in discussion, if there's a trial on television that's really popular, in speaking to them, you will begin to very quickly understand that that sentiment is not one that everyone has been told or knows innately.
No, people tend to think, you're basically guilty if you get arrested.
Mm.
In my opinion, that is the foundation of the legal system itself in America. Is because if it didn't exist, then it'd be kind of how things used to go down, which would be if someone thought, like a witch hunt. You assume someone's guilty, everyone starts to believe it, and then it's kind of like the beginning of 12 Angry Men. No one has really casted doubt yet. Like they haven't really thought about it and analyzed it. And I guess that is the the process of the jury and why the jury works um, fairly well. But obviously it has its issues.
Yeah, and I want to make one statement and then something that this movie like illuminated on top of that because I obviously the innocent until proven guilty, that's always been like into my teens or certainly past the age where I would have been eligible to get pulled in for jury duty. That was something that I was aware of. But this movie illuminated the fact that just because the defense doesn't illuminate a proper defense or an effective defense doesn't mean like, hey, every tool that they used at their disposal was ineffective. It doesn't mean you can't think critically about it yourself, in order to get to the base of it and find that source of the doubt in the case, which I thought was really interesting because honestly, if I had never seen a movie like this and just got picked for jury duty, without thinking about it, if a case wasn't really laid out as to why there's a reasonable doubt, I don't know if I would have the forethought to look at it critically myself to try to create that. Does that make any sense?
Oh, completely. The job of the defense attorney, and what the best defense, or at least criminal defense attorneys do, is try and paint a picture of reasonable doubt. So they will go in and they'll find the biggest flaws in the case, and that could be bad police procedure, or usually they find, like, you think of the O.J. Simpson case, they find little things that the police or law enforcement typically did, where they screwed up a little bit, and then they blow that up and they tell you why that little screw up can lead to someone being innocent, or them reasonably believing someone's guilty, where that little mistake they made could cast a huge doubt onto whether someone's guilty. And I think that's shown really well in the jury room and discussion in 12 Angry Men. But it's kind of like other jurors start bringing up reasonable doubt, just like a defense attorney would, like with the knife
Mm-hmm.
situation, with the glasses and the train. All those things are something that a defense attorney would be looking for when they're reviewing a case, like little inconsistencies.
Yeah, and it gets to the source of like one of the um, kind of feelings that I have that I think is really important when looking at law. That, in my opinion, and I mean, it's a famous quote, so I think a lot of people resonate with it, is I would rather see 1,000 guilty men free than one innocent man jailed. And I'm sure you're probably very familiar with that saying.
Yeah, because I think the worst thing that I've seen, in my opinion, like what I like to see the least, I guess, in criminal justice is when you hear the stories of, this guy was incarcerated for 30 years and now they can prove he's innocent. And an interesting thing I was thinking about during this movie is back in the 50s, it was way easier to be convicted of something you didn't do because oftentimes they only had eyewitness testimony, which I've learned through experience, not personal, but just like learning about it, that that is so often false because, and it's not like people are misremembering on purpose. It's just the way you remember things is not accurate a lot of the times.
Yes. Um, I think it was I'm gonna say sociology, but it might have been psychology class where they go into that, and like multiple sources of media, like kind of covered how false memories can take place, and I think one of them was this show called Brain Games, and it's trying to and it has you involved as an audience member, which really drives the point home because they have like something unexpectedly they depict a mugging, and they then go through questions that would be asked of you probably by an officer reporting to the scene of the crime, like what is the color of the shirt of the person that was involved in the robbing, how many people, what did the person who was robbed look like. And when it's you in the shoes of someone being interrogated or not just questioned, man, those details become fuzzy, and you become like very confident of answers that later you see you were completely wrong. It is astounding how valuable memory can be. um, and this is taking it a bit on a tangent too, but I'm sure, Matt, you're probably pretty familiar with how false confessions have become a large talking point too, and that they are finding that that is quite common, to where a confession on the face of it, especially if it's detracted, you can't use that as a piece of evidence, like a concrete piece of evidence of guilt, because of how frequent those are as well.
Right, right. On your first point, I think I played that same game in my psychology class in high school, interesting enough. And I do remember how hard it is to remember. And they also pointed out by asking one of those jurors like about the movies he saw and the details, which I thought was interesting. But false confessions, yeah, I've watched, I'm a big consumer of true crime stories and media in general. And those are always the saddest cases because I'll watch, the interrogation and what the police do when they're, not acting how they should in terms of getting a confession is they really, really think this guy did it. And so it's it's like they start asking them questions, but they're pointing them in the direction that they want them to answer it. So you're not supposed to, when you're a police officer, give away certain details about the crime. You're supposed to ask questions and they're supposed to answer, such as, you know, how many bullets did you shoot? Things like that, or how many times do you think you stabbed them, or where did you stab someone? Because those things are something only the perpetrator is going to know. And so if they get all of those right, you can pretty much be sure that they're, the criminal. But if you start saying like, did you stab them like 3 times, and you start like giving them answers, then and they just start, confirming, oh yeah, it was three,
Hmm.
stuff like that. That's when you start going into the false confessions territory.
And that can be so damaging. A true crime case that is pretty famous now, thanks to the work of Netflix, I believe, that really gave the mainstream audience a way to consume the facts behind this huge case, is the Henry Lee Lucas case, who I think made upwards of 1,000 confessions of murders, and a lot of, and I'm sure he probably, was at one point on the hook for murders, near your neck of the woods, Matt. But because it was all over an interstate that went throughout the country, through Texas, and the interstate that goes through Texas. But what is so damaging about that is if you ask those leading questions as a detective and then let someone take the rap, even if you kind of had to guide them towards the confession, is that if he is the convicted murderer, and now you can wipe your hands of the case, then the actual guilty party is got off scot free, and then a crime like that could be perpetrated by that person again because you got the wrong guy.
Yeah, that was, I think, the craziest. I watched that as well. I think that was the craziest case of false confessions I had seen. It was like he was being rewarded
Mm-hmm.
for falsely confessing, and which was that whole thing was, very strange. I mean, obviously he had killed people, but now it's like you're taking away justice for the people that he probably didn't kill just so that you can say, oh, as a police officer, when I worked here, I solved X amount of cases, and it just turns into a statistic, which isn't what it's supposed to be about. But another, I'm sure you watched maybe Making a Murderer too
Mm-hmm.
quite a while ago. That was another thing that I've seen where, or another, I guess, type of inducement of a false confession, where they take someone they know is a little slow mentally. I believe his name was Brandon. It wasn't. I'm not talking about the main.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the guy that he indicated helped him, and that kid didn't know like what he was doing, and I think that was, in my opinion, that was the worst one I saw because he was basically being coerced into the confession, like pretty clearly, in my opinion.
I remember distinctly what you're talking about. I might get his last name wrong. I believe it is Brandon. Maybe Dempsey was his last name, and I think he's like the younger cousin of the main person in Making a Murderer. But yes, not only was, because there was some video of the interrogation, and it's heartbreaking because he has no sense of the how bad what he just did is. Not only the crime, but also admitting to the crime. Because he says, am I going to be home for WrestleMania? Which is like, dude, you're not going to be home for the next 25 WrestleManias. Like, after you admitted to being, a co conspirator to murder. Let me ask you this, because I think it is interesting, and I can't quite remember if this was the distinction that got him off. But can a confession with someone from someone with diminished capacity be pulled as evidence in the use of the trial?
I would say I'm not 100% sure like what the exact rules about that are, but I would think that if the confession uh, was determined, they would like review it and then they would try and determine if it was coerced and if if they weren't leading them on and they asked, all these questions that only the person that did it knew, and then they answered all of those, correctly, then I imagine yes, it would be.
Mm, yeah, and I think something that 12 Angry Men outlined really well too is when your defense attorney is and I can't remember the legal term for it, but you have bad counsel essentially. If let's say it's not this jury, it's like a someone where all 12 is just they just all go guilty, don't think very critically about it. After the decision is made, can you then make an appeal based on bad counsel?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Actually, you can appeal for a lot of reasons, but yeah, you can appeal for bad counsel, and then that can get, if it's proven that they really didn't take your case in the way that they should have, then they can be disbarred if it's bad enough.
I guess in this case it would become quite clear because obviously Henry Fonda is able to do it himself as an architect. So it would some another lawyer then look at the case and say, "Hey, look, these are all the consistencies that I would have brought up had it been my case. So this lawyer really should have pointed any of these out and he did not." Is that kind of how the review goes, or does a judge do it using that same kind of thought process?
I'm not. I've actually been interested. They're called maybe called a malpractice case, like you're a lawyer committing malpractice, and I'm not 100% sure how they work, but I imagine it's a judge that looks over it. And yes, what you just said, they would probably use a standard like, and this is the thing about legal analysis. They'll have certain standards. They'll be like, well, was this reasonable, or did they
Mm,
have probable cause, or was there reasonable suspicion? And these are all different kind of levels of like analysis. Then they'll say, okay, well, probable cause requires, X, Y, and Z, and reasonableness only needs this. So they might say, would a reasonable attorney in this position who is doing his job correctly have made all these arguments that Henry Fonda's character made? And I imagine if those arguments weren't made, I would say, probably that attorney could be in trouble for some sort of malpractice because those were all, uh, I would think, the types of doubts that a good or what they would call a prudent defense attorney would bring up in the case. And the fact that it wasn't in the case is kind of speaks to maybe the defense attorney was not the best or didn't really do his job well.
yeah, and I don't know if you notice this at the beginning, and I think the only reason I was able to is because I kind of remembered part of it from when I watched this years ago, and like knew the story beats of how this went, and knew kind of going in that the defense was pretty inadequate. But there was a man walking out of the courtroom and he looked like he was sweating bullets, like, oh my god, I just butchered that. And I would assume that was the defense attorney walking out of the courtroom. Like it looked like he kind of realized he screwed the pooch on that one.
Yeah, I didn't notice that, but you're probably right because, honestly, lots of people really want to be, or not lots, but some people want to be public defenders. And so when you have a defense attorney, if you don't have money to afford an attorney, you're provided one, and that's a public defender. And as a public defender, you work basically for the state, and in the sense that they assign you with cases, and your counsel is free to your client. So often what happens is these people that are public defenders kind of, in my opinion, are put in one of the worst positions because they have so many cases and they don't get paid very much money, and they're also only supposed to, they're actually hourly, or not hourly, but they'll tell you, instead of working like 60 or 70 hours at a typical firm, as a public defender, you might have a sanctioned 40-hour work week. So you have all these cases, and you're supposed to get all this work done, but you don't have nearly enough time to do it. And then, going up against someone who has money or a prosecutor, um, oftentimes it's about the resources. You just don't have enough time and resources to really give it your best when you have, like, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 cases you're working on all at once. And so it's just I imagine it's such a terrible feeling walking out, knowing you could have done more, but just with what you were given, you just really couldn't.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is probably still relevant today. And it's crazy that it's like something that's identified at this time period, and like I guess I'll ask you, to your knowledge. I mean, is that still not a problem that has really been quite solved yet?
Oh, it's still a problem for sure. And it's also the other way around, where if you can afford to hire some really high-powered attorneys, what they'll do is they'll start, like, for example, say you're, arrested on something really bad, and what the defense will do is they'll start filing motions to, like, suppress evidence. So they're going to start challenging, for example, your interrogation. They're going to say, you know, the law enforcement went over the line here. Maybe they slipped up somewhere on your reading you your Miranda rights or something, or the way they seized your computer or searched your home was improper. And so they'll start bringing up these objections. And what happens is the prosecutor office then doesn't really have the time or resources to keep going on this long litigation battle, because these things will be they'll string them out for years and years, by calling all these hearings, and essentially they have the money, time, and power to extend this process. Whereas the other side is, if you get a public defender, usually you're going to go in there and they're going to tell you you need to make a plea deal with the prosecutor
Mm.
because you don't want to go to trial. So, say like the maximum you could get for what you were charged with is like 15 years. Well, you're going to go meet with your attorney, and you're going to meet with the prosecutor, and they're going to try and work out a deal maybe to get you 5 years. And that's so that they all save those times and resources. But when you hire those good defense attorneys, they're then making enough money to put the effort in to basically set up all these obstacles.
So essentially, it just becomes a war of attrition as opposed to like a journey to find justice, true justice.
Yes, yes. And this is coming from my experience interning in a courthouse. This is just like from my observations, kind of the conclusions I made from what I saw.
And the crazy thing about that is, I think there is a sentiment amongst society that, like you said, the rich never fully. If they commit crimes, it's like they're almost untouchable once you have a certain amount of wealth. And there are prolific cases. One you mentioned, the OJ case, where he had like the super team of lawyers that were able to get him off what at the time of that case, just after watching documentaries, I think the public opinion was like 80% thought that he was guilty. And I mean, certainly as you go through the facts of that case, at least I was completely convinced of his guilt. Don't know if that's a hot take or not, but like another case is like the Menendez brothers, where despite the fact that they were found guilty, their attorney at one point was appealing the use of the word murder in a trial in which the two were accused of murder. It's absurd what money and the lawyers who are super well paid, have tons and tons of resources, are able to kind of try and go for, and sometimes are able to succeed in, which really tips the scales of justice.
Yeah, that's it's strange. I've noticed that exact same thing. On appeal, oftentimes, I think a lot of the times it's for a specific types of cases. They might be easier to do it, maybe in something that involves newer laws like computer crime laws,
Mm.
because they're just not as established. But yeah, what they'll do is if you can find any sort of, I don't know if legal loophole is the best word, but it's more like a lot of the way the law works is that it's decided on, whether something, for example, was reasonable. And then you'll go and you'll find cases that are of a similar facts to your own, and you'll be like, hey, in this case, um, the judge decided to you know pick this way, pick for the defendant, say, and our case is similar for all these reasons. And so, like in that case, you should also, choose, in favor of the defendant. And because the courts like to stay with legal precedent, so they like to follow what has been decided in the past. So oftentimes, it's just the best attorneys can either make the best arguments to a judge, but then you also have those other attorneys who are really good at appealing to juries. And that to me is more like like being a maybe good actor or a
Mm.
good presenter. Because, convincing a jury is an entire different world than convincing a judge.
Yes, I think I kind of discussed the only like legal knowledge background, like academic background I had, was from a business law class that I took. And I remember distinctly, like, he had been a lawyer previous to being a professor, and he showed us a scene from the movie with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. I think it's called A Few Good Men, if I'm correct. And he showed Tom Cruise kind of appealing to the jury. I believe there was a jury in the case. I might not be correct on that. But anywho, his statement completely mirrored what you just said. That he says sometimes it doesn't take the legal knowledge isn't paramount. Sometimes it's your ability to speak to the jury and convince them that is most important in some cases.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, I'm not super familiar with the OJ trial because I was either not born or like a infant or child when it happened. But that case, I think, from my recollection, they kind of convinced the jury that the LA police were, racist in general. And, I'm sure, especially at that time, that had truth to it. And they probably had a lot of, and, police obviously still do have a lot of bad racial motivations. But just by bringing that doubt into how they conducted their investigation, that's all they needed to do was convince them that they they did it improperly, or they investigated improperly. And a lot of the times what a defense attorney is looking for is just a mistrial, something that would give basically something that kind of goes against the law, I guess, or a procedure that was done incorrectly in the trial that makes the whole trial have to be thrown out.
Yeah, that case specifically feels like two prong, like prime examples of flipping the case on its head and putting the pieces of the prosecuting party on trial instead. So, like you said, the LAPD was on trial on that case, even like as equally to OJ, and you had to question their motives and whether they were guilty before you could even begin the process of putting OJ on trial, which feels like a textbook case for any defense attorney on how you can like take the upper hand when you're kind of working up a hill, and also with the great orators of the time, what he was able to do is literally coin a phrase that is still remembered to this day. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. The fact that I can remember that for a trial, like you said, that I don't even think we were born yet, I mean, just truly speaks to how powerful that was. And you almost can't fault the jury for being, mesmerized by that and thinking, yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me, and buying in to what the attorney is selling.
Yeah, that's and I believe he had some of the best lawyers in the country. So they were some of them were professors, if I remember right. And so these guys knew what they were doing in terms of being able to convince a jury in that way. And I've never been on a jury. I actually, have someone I know pretty well that was for a pretty important case, and they, were exhausted from it. But it's just, I imagine, you're just sitting there. You have no idea what it's about before you start the trial, and then you're presented with, two different versions of events. A lot of the times you're gonna just believe the one that was makes more sense to you, and that might be because it was presented more well, or it makes more sense. So that appeal that they have to make to the jury is, I think, the most important part of a trial, of being a good trial attorney. I think that another thing that they do oftentimes, it's all about character, either character assassination or enhancing someone's character. And I saw, them kind of fail at that, at those that family, the dad that recently murdered his family, the Murdaugh trials, or Murdaugh,
Hmm.
and he tried to paint him, as a loving father and husband, but then when he got up on the stand, I think it kind of fell apart for them.
Yeah, so, and being able to keep that consistency is probably really paramount, because once you kind of you attempt to paint a picture, if that gets ruined, then your credibility as a lawyer begins to go out the window. And I would imagine the jury then begins to look very critically at everything you try to say from then on out.
Yeah, yeah, and another common thing, I see in trials and in 12 Angry Men, that I feel like is might be the most common, is pointing out how someone might be, oh, and even in the verdict too, how someone might be a liar, and therefore you can't trust anything they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is often like in a lot of the media, a lot of movies, especially, or TV. If they can catch you in one lie, they are going to just crucify you for that. They're going to say, well, then every single statement you've made, how can we trust what you said? Now every statement you're making on the stand has to be reinforced by another piece of evidence to hold that up if they can catch you in a little minute lie.
Right, right. Because it it makes sense for some of them. For some reasons they use it, but a lot of the times, you know, they're just doing it to paint that picture of this person can't be trusted.
Hmm. What I really enjoy about this film as well is it tries to kind of depict a picture of kind of societal prejudices. One of them is bigotry, which is, I would imagine, in the 1950s is something that can be much more. You could be much more open about, as you see in this film. One distinct character is kind of openly racist, and then on top of that, the other facet that I would think is probably pretty true, and it might not be depicted the same way in real trials, but it gets to the point of it very concisely with this film, is that a lot of people think that they're moving or making their decisions based on logic are way more motivated than emotion than they would ever be willing to admit.
100, I completely agree with that. What I was gonna, say, was stemming from my last point. Why the movie kind of shows how well those kind of character building slash assassination arguments work with juries, because the first thing they talk about when they go in is his background and how he was raised and if he was, a quote unquote good kid or not. And so that's like what it seems to be this jury is taking away first and foremost is what do we think this guy is like? If we knew him personally, would we think he was a troublemaker, or would we dislike him, or would we think he's a good kid? It's kind of like that feeling you get where you just want to make a conclusion because you think you're so sure that someone is a certain way, and oftentimes that's just not the case, and that's that fine line that this movie draws, I think, and it does it really well.
Yeah, and I find that it's uh it's so interesting from a or a sociological perspective, because stereotypes can be criticized for a lot of things, and certainly there's a lot of situations in which that is very negative and can kind of make you close minded. But for safety reasons, some stereotypes can be beneficial to you. And I'm gonna speak from like a statistical point of view and not get into to too much into the weeds. But if there is like a high crime rate neighborhood, it's probably a good idea to lock your car, right? People take this really, really far, and this movie outlines it. That it's like neighborhoods with high crime rate. Well, if you come from there and you're accused of a crime, then you must have committed it. So it's almost like taking it like, 5 degrees too far. And it completely takes the case by case basis that you need to look at all trials at, out of the, throws it out of the window. And obviously, this movie illuminates how that can be detrimental to like actually trying to get to justice.
Yeah, that was one of the first things I learned about just going into law school and studying for this the LSAT, kind of the entrance exam that you like an SAT for law school, was one of the most common logical fallacies that people have is generalizing or applying a general something general to this specific case. So like what you just said, because someone comes from a bad area and or comes from an area, say, where cars are stolen often, and there's maybe some small evidence that they could have, like eyewitness testimony, maybe someone saw them or someone they thought looked like them around the area at that time, And then, especially back in the 50s, that would be enough oftentimes to lock someone up. So you have cases where you have a lot of cases where they're targeting people in these high crime areas simply because they're in that area and because they might fit the description or they kind of fit the description. And so now you get, people applying these generalized stereotypes they have of people that come from X neighborhood to, oh, well, since he's from there, he must be like this. And that's something that is so common. And I just think all areas of life and generalizing in general, I guess, are making things, out to be something that they just might not because you're not looking at the specific facts enough, or there's not enough specific facts for you to make a conclusion you're sure about. So you just go back and say, well, it's probably him because, he's someone that would do something like this, which is the common thing people would say.
Exactly. One of the characters that I thought looked at the case, he was one of the staunch guilty, you know, holdouts for a long period of time. And looking at the picture, I think he's one of two people who wore glasses. And it wasn't until the kind of eyewitness testimony was they were able to put a shadow of doubt on that testimony that he switched. I loved the way he looked at it. It was like he was convinced purely based on one what he believed to be a factual statement, and he held true to his belief. But then, after that shadow of doubt was able to be raised, he then also was open minded enough to switch his vote.
Yeah, which part or like which thing that they brought up is the one that made him doubt it? Because I'm kind of trying to figure out which one he is.
It was the woman who witnessed it through the train car, and they brought up that she had the indentations that many glasses would leave on your nose. He wore glasses himself, and after they said, well, she said she saw it from her bed, and what are the odds that in the seconds that the murder took place, she threw her glasses on to be able to see clearly the killing that she testified to seeing.
Yeah, yeah, I remember that part now. Yeah, I liked that character too. I thought I thought he wasn't gonna change sides. There was a lot of that where I was um, like I could never see it ending. It was just funny how the whole thing ends up working out.
And I think that speaks to another, um, I'll say, fallacy of what being in a jury can be, is that if you don't see an end in sight, um, and maybe it's way less likely on a murder case, but I mean, there can be people that are just like, man, like this is gonna take forever. I'm just gonna stand down and like, look, I'll go with you guys, and we'll just get this over with.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing about like the main issue that I hadn't thought a lot about um jury, I guess, you know, how a jury operates that much until I watched this film and I was like, man, these they're just getting sick of having to, be in this room and do this. And so what have they really come to the right conclusion here? Like that's what I'm left with, you still don't know if he's guilty or not guilty, and it's kind of like you're not supposed to know. And you just kind of watch them make the decision because they're so fatigued, or they're just at the end, at least I guess the last guy they have to convince changing from guilty, he just seems like he's given up and he doesn't care anymore, which is, the characters say multiple times how terrible it could be if you just give up. And I believe there's that one juror who who talks about how he just decide he switches and he has no reason for it, and you can tell he wants to be done, and then they all start getting upset with him.
He was one of the funniest characters of the bunch. And there was like one legitimately hilarious moment where he threw a paper ball at the fan and then it hits the old guy in the face. I completely had forgot about that scene. And it's just a little throwaway joke that they added. And it was, I don't know, just wanted to highlight that small little piece that I found pretty funny.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I love the way I love the acting from all of them too. I have to say, you can kind of like feel the mood in the room.
Yeah, it's one of the most tense movies I've ever seen. And I think honestly part of that is a small detail that is rooted back to the fan is literally seeing them like sweat through their shirts and having to dab their head. Like you can easily kind of put yourself in their shoes. Like generally the only time I'm sweating the way they are is if I'm like working outside, and they're in a building sweltering heat and I'd be like clawing at the door to get out of there and they're just stuck and it builds this rising tension throughout and in a really quick runtime like you feel the tension build the entirety of this movie.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because it's the way they kind of evolve it. It's like they bring in a new reason to doubt the guilty verdict, and then they discuss it for a while, and it's kind of like then a new reason pops up, and then after so much time, it's like they're getting more upset with each other. They're tired of being there. They just want to leave. And at the same time, someone's life is on the line. And so it's so important. It's almost like they feel as if they can't make the correct decision.
Yes. And ultimately, and then I gotta kind of think about like the thought I'm trying to get out, but it feels like at least some level of justice is done. In that, I don't know, because you can really argue the fact that the prosecution actually was the one that bumbled this case, because they didn't present of like a concrete prosecution. If a juror was able to work through it, and ultimately that is the way it should be, where the prosecution should have to, without a shadow of a doubt, prove the guilt. And so I originally wanted to say you feel as though justice has been done, but then you also feel as though, well, the fact that they were able to cover up for the side of the defense, which ultimately law is supposed to, keep the innocent from being prosecuted incorrectly. You also, it's like there's almost an entire second half where it's like someone should be looking at the prosecution and say, there was a lot of deficiencies and you leaned almost on all circumstantial evidence, and now we don't know who really did this. Like you messed this up pretty bad. It's an interesting kind of thought that it doesn't really strike you, but you mentioning that really does drive it home.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go on a mini tangent here, just about evidence in general. But that's the thing about especially cases before they had DNA evidence. It was oftentimes based on these like flimsy uh, eyewitness testimony, and what they're doing a lot of this times they're picking apart how those weren't exactly accurate, which is something, the defense should have been doing. But what you're saying is right. The fact that the prosecution didn't prove all of those things, or the fact that the jurors could raise all these doubts themselves, means the prosecution didn't prove without a reasonable doubt. So I think, in a way, justice was served at the end. I think you're right. And something I wanted to add, though, my little tangent, is about how evidence has evolved, especially not just with DNA now, to where you can almost say, let's say it's an unknown killer and they have that DNA and then they match it to someone. You can almost say for certain that was them, because why would their DNA be in a random house, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you also have, and I'm actually taking a class on about digital evidence right now, and I think that is paramount in every way to eyewitness testimony, because now you have things like, we can see where you were at this time. Like now you could see, when was, like, I believe something they did in that Murdoch case is they saw when all the victims last used their phone. And
Mm-hmm.
they saw in that Idaho murder case, they could see how, I believe they could see how he was stalking the house because he had been there for like a certain amount of time on several different dates. And so your electronics carry, I think, so much information that can be used as evidence now that it overrides any sort of eyewitness testimony, and it's basically factual. I mean, this kind of stuff, I mean, yeah, stuff can be, Photoshop, but things like, location information that police have access to now can give you almost certain um, probability that something occurred, and that someone was probably guilty of it.
Yeah, and what you just said really speaks to why the prevalence of a serial killer seems to be like a lot less rampant than what you would see in the maybe late 60s 70s, that time period where DNA evidence wasn't nearly what it is today, and then technology was like just, I'll say, primitive in comparison. Like those two things have made it impossible. I mean, you really, you super illuminated a point when you brought up the DNA, because what made a serial killer so difficult to find back then was, it's like, how the hell do you, there's no like logical motive when a serial killer kills a random person. It's usually a sexual thrill, and most people don't do that. There's no connection between those two people, and that makes it super super difficult. But now it's like, hey, why were you 50 miles from your home? I mean, usually that's not the case, but you don't know this person. Why is your hair or why is your DNA in their house? Like you just said. I mean, that's like, you're getting nailed on that for certain. And then I think the thing that you also brought up that is something that a lot of people have like been like, if you have a cell phone, you can't just, your location is being constantly tracked. It's like, you almost have an ankle monitor on you at all times. So it definitely seems to speak to why those like prolific evil serial killers that used to be so commonplace just aren't so much anymore. And it is kind of crazy how that has stopped one crime, and also potentially, I don't know, because this is definitely something psychologically and sociologically that's trying to be kind of dissected, but seemingly is what has made the mass shooter be so prevalent in this time period. I think it is potentially the revelation that serial killing is like, you almost can't do that, and it's a younger, you know age group that is committing most mass murders, but I do think that there is a lot, like, there is some logic between those two. I don't know if you feel the same way, Matt.
No, I get that. I understand that connection. It's kind of like these people that are mass shooters maybe would have been serial killers, but because most of the time serial killers expect to get caught eventually, and it's just kind of like they're living like a thrill, kind of like they're addicted to a drug, and every time they kill, it's like a new rush for them. But now it's like they decide, I'm probably not going to get away with this. Let me just and I don't care about my own life anyhow. So I'm just going to end as many people's lives as I can right now, because like screw it or something. I don't know the way they think, but yeah, because I mean there are still serial killers today, but it is definitely not like it was, back in and with the big scares in I guess the 70s primarily. Where you had these people going around and they there was just no way to really connect them. Oftentimes, they choose like victims that don't really have families, or people that will report them missing. And so there's a lot of there's ways they could do it still today, but I think just with the presence of all the cameras and the electronic evidence and whatnot, it might just they might just be like, it's not worth it or something. Who knows? But yeah, I think it's turned more from a maybe serial killer thing into in order to get famous to now I'll be a mass shooter and be famous for this same sort of notorious conduct.
Yeah, and I think it's generally that is the motivation is notoriety, and seeing the prevalence of mass shootings in the media. I think has driven that home. Whereas maybe someone would have seen the media traction that a Son of Sam is getting, and like, and I think a Son of Sam is someone who was also motivated from that very same kind of through line where he maybe had read up on a Jack the Ripper and maybe a Zodiac that I think, if I do recall, was happening at the same time period as Son of Sam. And I could be incorrect on that, but I think you see that, and these people are very, very unfulfilled in their life and they feel very small, and they see this as the path of least resistance to become notorious, to have their name in the papers, to have people thinking they're larger than life when in reality they're just these sick, demented losers who really couldn't make it at anything they ever tried, which is really, really important. And I think that same mentality is very innate to what drives mass shooters. And I think that's like only a subset of serial killers. And I think that is why we do still see serial killers while mass shooting is taking off. But I think that's probably why the prevalence of it is not quite what we had seen, decades and decades ago.
Yeah, and I think, part of the prevalence probably of the serial killers came from, people being really scared. I remember uh the most recent one that I think could have, I think if it were for lack of digital evidence, I think that Idaho killer
Mm.
probably would still be free right now, and that whole campus would still, like the University of Idaho would still be super scared for their lives, because you don't still wouldn't know, is it a student here, all this, so that fear kind of spreads, and then, what if you see eh, the same style of killing in another state across the country? I mean, can you imagine the type of paranoia? I'm pretty glad I didn't live in that time period, because I think I would have been a victim of being super scared and paranoid about me being the next person that the serial killer was going to target.
Absolutely. And that the killing happened, like, I believe maybe a month or a few weeks prior to Christmas, and I remember at family gatherings, I mean, that was like a hot topic of discussion. Like, oh, I think, there was this piece of evidence, and the police chief was stating, like, no, that's not a person of interest. And everyone was just enamored by this case. And like you said, if the killings, that was the first killing, and obviously I think there was 3 people murdered, so that has a bit more of an impact than just one. And I'm not saying, lives are, only important based on quantity. Everyone's life is worth a lot, but if it continues to happen, I can see that tension in society just mounting and mounting. And I think that the kind of thought patterns with the 12 Angry Men kind of falls back into that, is that people early on in the deliberation are not, they do not want to be the reason that a violent criminal is set free. And I think that that's a totally relevant and understandable kind of thought to have, where it's like, hey, the way they laid it out, it makes sense to me, and I don't want to have a person who would be capable of this being able to walk the streets again. And a lot of the people who were staunchly guilty were saying, like, we're gonna let these just their imaginations get the best of us. We're going to let our emotions and these bleeding hearts let a guilty man free. I mean, you can certainly understand why someone would really want to stick to their guns when it comes to a murder case.
I know. I was thinking about how, and this is kind of what's always scared me about having to be in a jury. I've always wanted to kind of avoid having to do jury duty, and I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to do it when I become an attorney. But it's because if you get it wrong either way, the consequences can just be some of the worst. I mean, because say you find him guilty and he's not, then you put an innocent person in jail potentially for life, or you had them executed, and then if it's the other way, and say they get out and they kill someone else, well then you feel responsible for that. So it's like it's a lose lose, and I mean you gotta win in order to like for justice to be served. I guess is the best way to put it. I mean, because it's like not getting it right is really really bad.
Yeah, exactly. And that this movie does a really good job of kind of, yeah, I think they really paint both sides of the debate pretty, like, they fully flesh it out. And it would be something very easy to overlook because you don't often put yourself in those shoes, unless you're in them truly. And that is something that this movie does really well. Matt, I want to ask you any kind of additional points that you wanted to bring up about this film that we didn't get to touch on yet.
Um, hmm. I I mean, I guess we already kind of talked about it, but I just thought it was interesting how the whole movie, like you're watching them kind of change their mind throughout it, but then I guess I also kind of changed my mind. Like I kind of had an idea at first, he's probably they're probably gonna all switch, or I really didn't know. But throughout the movie, I kind of with them, like you kind of feel like you're like on the jury a little bit. You're like, oh my gosh, like are these guys ever gonna, make a decision? And then by the end, I felt like with it all fleshed out, it still felt like some jury members didn't uh didn't win. I think winning is the wrong word, but it's like they had their points, but then they just kind of got defeated in the arguments, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah, and I think kind of the they had the intention of being fully convinced, and that's just not the way the law works. And I
Exactly.
I think that's like the movie the way, or like the best way to describe the movie in one sentence.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's what I was trying to get at.
Which, I mean, and that is the, I don't know. It is what's crazy about that is it feels like any big time case you see anymore, people are so they want to be convinced. And when a public trial like the Casey Anthony one, people will die on the hill of what they, the majority of people think Casey Anthony committed the murder, right? And people will die on that hill. That's just the mentality that the majority of people have, is that they will just completely be, I can't think of the word, but they will be completely convinced of their beliefs.
Yep, yep, and that's another thing I've been always been worried about, having to get on a jury is you get those one or two people, and they show it here that it's like you can't really convince them, and so maybe by the end you've convinced them only because they want to stop, not because they truly believe it.
Yeah, and then you have like a almost a sense of like, man, was that the right thing? I mean, these people aren't entirely convinced of this. Did we just kind of shortchange justice?
Right. Yeah.
Matt, what is your rating for 12 Angry Men?
My rating is 4 out of 5 stars.
And mine is 4.5. I I honestly think, had I watched it fresh, the surprise of them actually able to all be convinced might have put it to a 5. But after rewatching it, it does lose a bit of the suspense in that. And I honestly think that's the only reason that, you know it's not quite one of my favorites. But for how limited it was, I was really, really impressed.
Yeah, yeah. I thought this was a great movie.
Yeah.
It's really good.
The next film we're going to go over is The Verdict, starring Paul Newman. He is what they call an ambulance chaser in this film. And before I kind of go any further, um, have you heard that phrase, Matt? Is that a frequent phrase in the legal community?
Yes, yeah, yeah. It's just a person, like a term for what you call a personal injury attorney.
Okay. And in this case, it is a mother who was, uh, well, she was pregnant, giving birth, and the anesthesia seemingly made her vomit and then asphyxiate on her vomit, which essentially, I think, put her into a coma and definitely gave her brain damage to the point in which she could not see, hear, or I don't know the other senses. I mean, she really couldn't communicate. And it seemed like she was almost completely brain dead, but maybe she could breathe on her own. Anywho, Paul Newman was almost completely down on his luck and uh, seemingly an alcoholic as well, but decided to make this specific case because of his emotional investment be the one that he would kind of get back on track in his career through taking the distance, despite the fact that a out of court settlement would have been very easy. He would have made $70,000. The family involved would have been able to kind of get get away from this case that has been like ailing them for years at this point. with enough money to have the sister taken care of. Paul Newman felt it was paramount to actually have justice served over the immediate incentive of money. Any other kind of critical points you think are worth mentioning, Matt?
No, I thought of one thing I said earlier that I want to kind of compare to now to make it a little more clear. So in the criminal law, I was talking about how public defenders will often make plea deals with the prosecutor. That can be seen as kind of the same. It's different, but it's kind of like the same thing in a civil trial, like a lawsuit. Would be settling, or a settlement would be kind of the equivalent to a plea deal.
I get what you're saying, and kind of correct me if I'm wrong, because I know there can be criminal trials, and then also you can follow that up with civil trials. So even had Paul Newman like screwed up, would the family still be able to go after the doctors in a civil trial, or would it be a really uphill battle because of what had been established in this case? Does that kind of make sense? I'm not including all the relevant details, but would him kind of blundering a lot of the mistakes, would then another lawyer kind of be able to clean up the mess after the fact in a civil case?
So and you know, this is a comment because I, even before I went to law school, I wasn't 100% sure like what civil meant, but this actually was a civil case. So there's this thing, it's kind of confusing, and I only really know because I took this torts class. So a lot of criminal acts, like you said, you could all like you would have thought this was a criminal case, right? Because he was responsible for someone going into a coma. It makes sense as that, but you have all these what they're called tort claims that can be made that are technically civil, and they settle for money. And it would be things like wrongful death.
Mm.
So someone who accidentally kills someone can, you know, you can go to jail for manslaughter, but then you can also get sued for like causing wrongful death. Or in this case, it would be called medical malpractice because the doctor screwed up to a point where he killed a patient. And oftentimes, if like the police can't prove that they did it without a reasonable doubt, so here's the difference. And if this isn't the best explanation, please tell me and I'll try. But in criminal, and it's because in a criminal trial, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is like this high level of proof that you have to meet. You have to say, right, yeah, the jury has to go in there and be like, okay, we're like for sure that this guy did it. Like I'm talking like 80% plus sure. And in a civil trial, like for wrongful death, like in this case, the jury would just have to be 51% sure. More likely he did it than not. So the burden of proof is less. You don't have to prove as much. So that's why oftentimes um, you can get civil damages, or in this case, like hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions for someone being killed in this way, and that's kind of like a way to satisfy, you know, maybe their relatives or whoever was part of the family or whoever cared for the person who died. They can file this lawsuit and then collect money. It's kind of like for their retribution.
Mm. That
Did you follow? Does that make sense?
that does make sense, and quite honestly, I didn't know that. I actually thought that you could try criminally and then civilly. And is that not the case? You can't go after them. No, wait, you did mention that you
And
could.
you can do both. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. Um Before we got on, you had kind of brought up that there was some legal inconsistency, and was there any like egregious ones that come to mind right away?
Yeah, the ones that and this is just like from me, being in law school. A couple things during the trial, a judge is never like the way the judge acted was I believe at one point he said I'm going Paul Newman said he was going to get him in trouble with the judicial board after that outburst he had and after the judge in court. Now that was completely like what that judge did. I think he would get in trouble for. Judges don't usually do stuff like that. They're not usually as biased as he was in this film. It was like he was really wanting to get the case out of his court, and he made it way too obvious to the point where any like reasonable person watching would realize that what he was doing wasn't right. And the only other one that stood out to me was the fact that Paul Newman could choose that he didn't want to settle. Now that is something that a lawyer could never do because a lawyer always has to listen to the client. So when those people, the family members were upset that he decided to do the trial instead of lawsuit or instead of settling with the money, that would not happen. You as an attorney, he would have had to meet with those because they would be his clients because they would be they're like in charge of the estate or they're the family members who now are you know, they're the ones that I guess care for the lady who died. And so they would have to be the ones to decide should we take the settlement or should we go to trial? It wouldn't be Paul Newman's choice. But that is what makes the movie interesting because that goes to his character, right? Because he, it was like a personal thing for him.
Yeah, I think that just kind of adds to the stakes because obviously, I mean, it's like a questionable decision. He's putting everything on the line to enact some sort of justice. But yeah, that I completely overlooked that on my viewing. But that is something that you definitely hear time and time again. It's like the lawyer has to, like you just said, so just reiterating, work in the best intentions of their clients. You know, you are working for your clients. So, but he was able to kind of depict that in a way so that, people like me, I was able to, it didn't even kind of resonate with me. Like, obviously, the weight of the decision resonated, but not the fact that, hey, he actually kind of went outside of what is even technically allowed. Now, just a specific question, could he get disbarred if the family after the fact was like, hey, I mean, I'm glad you were able to win, but that was also like messed up?
Yes, yes. He probably would be disbarred for something like that.
And here's just a small other detail that kind of speaks to how biased the judge was. And I don't even know if you would have noticed it. I don't even know why I noticed it, but the defense attorney had his coat hanging in the closet of the judge when they had the kind of meeting where they were going over the fact that this case was going to trial. And just for whatever reason, I mean, it wasn't super out of the norm. I only noticed it because, like, Paul Newman was trying to find a place to find or put his jacket at the beginning. And then as they're leaving, the other lawyer got his jacket out of the closet. And I was like, perfect visual depiction of, like, this judge actually kind of likes one of the lawyers and really doesn't like the other lawyer.
Yeah, I didn't notice that, but I think now that I think about it, probably that with a lot of other parts of the movie was probably going to try and show us the sense of maybe injustice overall in the legal system. How there's a few things. One, um, well, judges want to settle case or they like when there's an easier settlement because this judge in the movie felt like this wasn't something worth going to trial for and he felt like it was a waste of time and honestly you will see a lot of time judges they end up there. They kind of get a little big egos, I guess, and it's like their courtroom is kind of like their house. And if someone's in there, wait, what, and they feel like the judge feels like that person's wasting their time, they're gonna get really upset with them. And then also you have these relationships between judges and certain attorneys. And that's just the nature of the legal network that I've seen. Uh, they know, like judges will know prosecutors, and they'll know defendants like personally almost, and that they'll know like, okay, I'm hearing a case where so and so is involved today, like this attorney's involved, so I'm almost sure this is going to happen. He's going to say this or he's going to act this way, and I think maybe since he was so, it's kind of like business where a new personal injury case happens, they come in, they settle the case, boom, it's over, we're on to the next one. And it's just kind of a in and out, let's get this case in and out, over and done as quick as we can. And then when you have all of a sudden this attorney, maybe doing things that you find maybe disrespectful to the judge, like he might think this guy's taking out a personal vendetta in my courtroom, and I'm not having any of it. You get all these like subtle, more subtle than the movie, but weird relationships and occurrences that happen in courtrooms between attorneys and judges.
Mm. That definitely makes sense, and it makes like that little scene, I think, like really depict that pretty. Just this little detail is able to say so much, which I really liked, and Sidney Lumet is pretty creative when it comes to those things. The I guess the essence of what really resonated with me for this movie is quite early on. We are convinced as to the wrongdoings of the church, the I don't know if it's an archbishop or what have you, but regardless, we get testimonies. Everything happens outside of court to convince us of this, and we have the main drama being, can Paul Newman convince a jury of this despite everything kind of going against him as we get into the courtroom. This parallels kind of the subplot that gets buried, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's the actual kind of mystery, which I think is the girlfriend character that worked with the defense. I found that subplot to be the kind of the real emotional like heartbeat of this film, and was the actual like the best depiction of I think what Lumet was going for, where it's like having faith in what is right, or you having faith despite not having evidence. Does that make sense? And how did that storyline specifically strike you?
Yeah. So that was also what I found most interesting about this movie, but I am probably gonna have a different perspective than you, just because, you know, I've just seen, worked with tons of lawyers, going through law school now, know a lot of people that are gonna be lawyers, and uh, the way I saw it is he was burnt out as a lawyer, and this is just because here's what stuck out to me, and it's interesting that we kind of see it differently. Um, so they talk about how he was like number two in his class at Boston College Law, and he worked for like a big firm, and he was making lots of money, and now it's like he's um kind of like out of his, it's like his prime has passed him, and the scene that stuck out to me a lot was when he's first having a drink with that girl in his house, and he puts that picture of his wife down. I just was getting this sense that this guy drinks a lot. He feels like he's past the prime of his life. He feels like he's doing the same thing over and over, which is trying to find people that were injured, getting them settlements, and then doing it again and again. And this kind of goes with what you were saying about he's trying to search maybe for justice. It's like he's been dealing with the court or the legal system his whole life, kind of in maybe one way. After he started his own practice, he's been doing the same thing, and just he wants to maybe do something different. Or um, another part was when she tells him, how he feels like a failure, and he goes in the bathroom and like has a panic attack almost. You feel like, did his wife say that to him in the past, or did was that something that clients have said to him all the time, and he feels like he needs to prove himself. So that was kind of that was the most interesting part to me, was him, probably just because I'm gonna be a lawyer, him as uh an attorney, and how he feels, and how his life kind of works with the justice system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is something that Lumet does really well. Um, and it's when I think it's his law partner, the person who's been helping him throughout the entirety of this case, kind of lays out the entirety of his career and why he is at this station, and how he had been kind of caught in the middle of trying to, he didn't want a jury tampering to be done. Like, he wanted to actually win the case on his own merit, his own skill, his own hard work. And in trying to be a do-gooder, ends up having to take the rap for that, have his entire character assassinated, and it sent him into a tailspin. And it feels like this is his redemption arc. Um, the what made that woman so interesting is that you never fully know what her intentions were. You can only surmise that she's getting paid by him. It would make more sense than not that she's like filtering information to him, and then she calls him after the fact when she has nothing left to gain, and it makes you wonder, was she just feeding them false information and she truly loved him, or is she just trying to cover her own ass? You know what I mean? That was like, and that is why I loved the ending. And you can sense that Paul Newman is struggling with that himself as he hears the phone ring.
Right. Yes. I loved the ending. I thought that was the best. That was my favorite, I guess, part, because it's one of those that kind of tied that whole storyline, my favorite storyline within the movie, together. Um, Ties it together, and in the same time leaves it open ended so that you're questioning. But the whole time I was thinking, are we ever going to get a good sense of who she is? And she's kind of just like mysterious in a way. Like, um, y- it feels like she reminds him of probably his ex-wife. And, he just wants he really seems to like her, and then she turns on him, and then you don't know if she's the type of character that's just using people, or you don't know if she has feelings for him. And I'd say, based on how she was as an actress, it seemed like she really did care for him. That would be my guess, but I like the fact that we don't know for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And like the kind of the scenario that comes to mind that really brings it into question was played so well that it can go either way, is that she was like a motivating factor for him to keep going. And you look at it and you're like, well, maybe she's just pushing him to do this so that the other side can win, so that he doesn't just try to get a mistrial or get the judge in trouble, to be able to push it so that he can actually get the resources he needs. But at the same time, it allows him to dig deep enough to actually get the verdict, which I think, look, it inspired that speech, which was able to sway them. But I mean, from a legal standpoint, and they even state this in the film, legally he lost that case by kind of a landslide. But he was able to dig deep, I think, through her inspiration to get the jury to kind of put the law aside and do what they thought was right. So, it was played in such a way where you really can't determine it. And I love when movies can kind of do that effectively.
Yeah, that was the thing about the movie that I just didn't I guess I didn't know how to feel just because legally he did lose. And for me I'm just like, well, if this sort of happened in real life, I mean, obviously it's a movie, but this couldn't happen in real life. But I think what the movie was just trying to say is, sometimes justice, isn't, I guess, can't totally be bound by the law because here, the way the legal system operated in this movie was not pro justice. The way it was working was it was functioning like kind of how I was saying like a business. Like the judge wanted it in and out. He wanted it done quick, and when it doesn't, he tried to do everything in his power to make Paul Newman's character lose. And then even after he did everything he could, Paul Newman's character still ends up winning. So it's like that good ending. Uh, I mean, it's like the morally correct ending, but also, if they would have had him lose, I would think, how would I have felt about the movie? It would have been very different. It would have been more, the message would have been more like, the legal system sucks, I guess, instead of, it can suck, but also, you can maybe still, aside from the legal system, people know what's right and wrong. Maybe that's more of the message now because you see them ask for to give even more, an even higher value of damages to the family instead of settling for what was determined by the court at the end. So it goes to show like these people, they saw through the legal BS.
Exactly. And it works on a level too, because it's if well, I don't even know, the defense could maybe appeal that based on how it went. Is that a possibility, Matt?
Definitely, yes.
Okay. But I think the understanding is, it's like, look, this was a perfect storm, and now that all of these things have been exposed, like, they're going to be when this happens again, the appeal, they're going to be able to bring in all the evidence that Paul Newman uncovered, and I think our chances are really bad. You know what I mean? So it was like, despite everything, it was a perfect storm to where nothing was admissible that was needed, but it was used to get the verdict. And it's not going to be able to go, like, lightning isn't going to be able to strike twice that same way.
Right, right. I mean, well, like if this were to actually happen, they could appeal, but I don't know. It would be a complicated process because what happened in that courtroom was strange. But I don't know. Another thing I found interesting was the search for that nurse, and also how popular these types of cases are in the legal world. Or medical malpractice. There's a whole industry for it, And a lot of the time you see doctors, actually like this, where they really did do something bad. But then doctors also face a lot of lawsuits that they really didn't do anything wrong. So there's really it, it's one of those things where it can go both ways. And oftentimes there's the doctors might not even, it could have been an accident. And that's the whole lawsuit is, was it an accident, or was there something they could have done to prevent it?
Exactly. And just speaking to your point, like, the only names of current lawyers that I know are general. I mean, it's like the medical malpractice lawyers that I hear on the radio, that you see TV commercials for. I mean, that is clearly like one of the big industries of law that is huge money makers. That like I'm sure it's the same way for you in Texas, where there's probably names that come to mind where you're like, yeah, I know of so and so. I heard their law practice on the radio, which is really interesting. But like you said, I do find what this movie is trying to say is having faith in people, and having, like you said, that they know what is truly right and wrong. And his speech at the end was probably the best way to put it. It's like, you are the law, right? I mean, the judge is going to say, take no account of what she said, but you heard it and you know what's right and wrong. And trying to use that same sentiment that he used for the jury upon himself, as to whether that woman's intentions were good or bad, I think is the crux of what makes this interesting to kind of think about after the fact.
Yeah, yeah, and on the scale of, you're talking about the memorable attorneys. Usually it's those, there's different, you could call it genres, I guess, of personal injury. There's medical malpractice where they're going after doctors. There's different types of what you would call mass tort litigation, and that's like when you'll see,
Mm,
when you'll see, like a recent one has been like Camp, like if you were at Camp Lejeune, have you seen that
yes.
one?
Yes.
Yeah. So what that is it's like if you were, I guess you were at some camp. I think it's maybe during one of the wars. They pro- someone, probably scientists, have since found that maybe some chemical or something was being used there that they now that the attorneys will say they should have known that this could be dangerous. And so the fact that all these people were affected or could have been affected, uh, they're gonna take they're gonna take all these, like, thousands of people on as they're gonna get them all together, and they're going to sue like a huge medical corporation like Johnson and Johnson or something that was at the time. Like, were they really responsible for it? Not really, but they were technically in charge, right? Like legally they were in charge. So they're going to sue this huge corporation with thousands of plaintiffs, and so this is kind of that sense of, is this really right or wrong, and are these people really getting uh, anything in return? Because what usually happens in those cases is, um, the people who are affected maybe get a few dollars if they win, and the attorneys, meanwhile, are profiting millions of dollars from these cases. So it's that same kind of issue that's brought up in this movie. It's like, these attorneys, like Paul Newman's character, would typically just go in, try and get the settlement, and then he has a contingency fee. So he'll take a portion of that. He'll take like a more of that 200,000 maybe than even the clients. I'm not sure in this case, but oftentimes that will be what happens because the attorney will take so much from the settlement. So it's like the attorneys are chasing settlements. They don't want to bother going to court. They just want their money. So they're trying to get as many people who could be affected as possible, and they don't really care about justice for those people. I mean, they do, but like, really, what do you think their motivation is?
Yeah, exactly. And just to talk more to what you're saying, like Camp Lejeune, I think my grandfather was actually stationed there. I don't know if it is just Marines get stationed at Camp Lejeune, but I know for certain that Marines had been because I think he was stationed there at one point, but he has passed like almost a decade ago. But also speaking to those commercials, obviously the Camp Lejeune one I've seen numerous times, but also I have the word mesothelioma in my vocabulary only because of those commercials. And another really big one because of the institution they were going after was the concussion based settlements that ex NFL players, that class action lawsuit against the NFL, in which I think the payout was in the billions, which is just, I mean, that's insane to think about. And you just realize how big an industry that is. But yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense to want to settle out of court as well because you're expending way less resources, both time and energy. You don't have to hire extra people to do research. And on the flip side of it, the defense, they do a really great job of outlining why they too would like to settle out of court because look at the legal team that they have in place once they realize it's going to court. I mean, they have a freaking round table of lawyers and they're running TV ads, they're running newspaper ads. I mean, at that point it's like you have to imagine they're paying like nearly half of that right off the bat just in legal fees. So it makes perfect sense on both sides why the settlement is thrown out there to begin with.
Right, and that's the whole like nature of the system. It's um when all they're sitting around and discussing, all those attorneys are billing their time to the case, and we're talking hundreds of hours per attorney, uh sorry, hundreds of dollars per hour that each attorney is working on it. So legal fees, that's the thing. Like oftentimes, is it even worth it's just not worth going to trial because the legal fees would be so much that you may end up making less, even if you win, than just by settling. So one of the first things I learned in my first year of law school was how, in one of my civil procedure class, was how almost everything settles, and how, as an attorney and an attorney doing these civil lawsuits, you just have to learn how to negotiate with the other side and be good at finding a place to settle. We even learned a whole formula about when you should settle and when you shouldn't, and it's based off different factors, like added together, and the money, the potential, what's at stake in the lawsuit. Well, like you're suing for like $1 million, for example, different things like that. And in almost every case, it does make uh, monetary, like in terms of money, it makes sense to settle. But then so many times, you're doing what Paul Newman didn't do here. You're not really looking into it as much as you could have, and oftentimes you're probably missing out on uh, justice actually being served. And I think there's probably tons of instances where attorneys kind of know in the back of their heads something smells fishy about this, but we're just going to let it go. And oftentimes I think that can blow up in the future when they let it go for so long. The That company that keeps getting sued starts feeling invincible, and then it just is downhill from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I just want to throw out there was one quote that felt uh, like makes perfect sense. And I wanted to run it past you and see if this was something that was probably a piece of advice handed down while in law school. But they said never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. I'm assuming that's something that is genuinely, something that a sentiment that all lawyers should know and use.
Yeah, and I think that that came up here w- uh, for me when she you realize that she made another copy of the chart, and you know that he knows that or well, I guess he didn't know that she did that, but the attorney knew he was in the wrong. But then when she says that, it's kind of like it becomes game over. That's the kicker here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the key piece is that, at least the way I interpreted it, is the lawyer thought the doctor was able to pressure her to write 9 as opposed to 1. And I think where he was surprised and made an assumption and asked a question he didn't know the answer to was that he didn't realize his, what do you call it? The person he's defending was the person who added the hook to make it a 9, which that was an awesome reveal.
Yeah, I really liked that. I thought it was funny that he objected to his own question after that, which is something that he did not do. I thought that was funny. Because that's when they all it starts screwing up for that side.
And here's another thing, and this is just like something that I was interested in. What does it, when you say objection and then they overrule exception? What are you trying to do there? I guess. And what is that?
If you're
What does it mean? I guess.
when you're just like objecting.
No, because Paul Newman would object, and then they would say overruled, and he kind of seemed like he's like, okay, I expected that, but then he would say exception after the fact.
I am not familiar. See, I haven't taken. There's a rules of evidence course I haven't taken yet, which it would probably familiarize me more with that. So I'm not sure about exception,
Mm-hmm.
but when they say overruled, I'm sure that just means that uh, the jury isn't supposed to take that into account. And same when the judge tries to strike that entire testimony from the record, they're just saying, you act like this didn't happen.
Okay, so like maybe when he says exception, he's like, I I think this is that generally something like this should be thrown out, but this is an exceptional case of that. Can you rethink whether it should be thrown out?
Yes, yes. And I think it usually they would do the thing where they approach the bench and both of the attorneys would talk to the judge, and they would kind of have that little conversation there about that.
I got you. I would love to know what happens in those discussions with the judge.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to learning that about that stuff.
And I think like one of the last kind of major characters that is like illuminating two cases like this, and also I thought like to the time period, was the medical expert that Paul Newman had to really dig deep for because he had lost the anesthesiologist that was going to testify. So he needed to find someone last minute. And he gets off the bus and he finds out it is a black anesthesiologist. And he knew his background prior to him coming, but he had seen like he saw a ghost. And I think it spoke to the time period where he thought they might just not believe him, the jury, because of racial prejudices, or and then also the defense makes a point that treat him just like anyone else. They say it's an African American, and the guy kind of has a smile like oh, we're they're not going to take him seriously. And then the guy very professionally is like treat him just as any other doctor. That whole point or that whole section of the movie I found very very interesting as to like how stereotypes would play a really big role in a jury case. And then on top of that, just a person like him who they, made out to be like um a professional witness, I think is what they called it, or expert witness.
Yeah, yeah. So expert witnesses are just usually someone with a PhD or someone who would be considered an expert in whatever field, like an engineer. If you're attesting to evidence, you need someone who's an expert in their field telling you why the evidence might be true and not true. But yes, I thought that was interesting as well, and I thought it really was like because he also wasn't board certified. So another thing attorneys will do is if you lack certain credentials, or if you have, for example, if you have an expert witness and they have testified in like 20 other trials, all for say he was the plaintiff, Paul Newman, or the prosecutor, but we just call him the prosecutor. He uh, say that for example, that expert witness that they had, the African American anesthesiologist, had testified like in a ton of other cases for all for plaintiffs or prosecutors, then that's going to go against them because they're going to say stuff to the jury like it's once again just character assassination, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And those times they're going to use his race against him. They're going to use the fact that he wasn't board certified against him, and they're going to pit his other parts of his resume potentially, and also they're going to say, "Oh well, look, this guy has testified in like 20 other trials, all for this side. Can you really believe him, or is he just here for the paycheck?"
Exactly. And they bring that up, which was, to your point, just trying to dismantle his credibility any way possible. Um, they stay away from the race, which I do think that would honestly ingratiate him to the jury had they did that. So it was actually really astute to steer away from that. But a really kind of unique juxtaposition is that despite the fact that they don't, you know, attack him for his race, they do openly bring up his age as a matter to discredit him as well. They say, "How old are you?" And he says 74, and it's clearly an attempt to say, I mean, jury, can we trust someone of this age to do we trust his opinion? I mean, do we think he's like all there? Um really really well done. And then the kind of chess move of Paul Newman in realizing his expert testimony had kind of fallen to sunder was to use the doctor on trial whose credentials had been built up the entire trial as the expert testimony to ultimately drive the final nail in. So he used his book literally against him, and obviously the evidence that drove the stake in was supposed to be inadmissible but was impossible to like unhear once it was heard. But that was a stroke of genius, I thought, in the case.
Yeah, I loved that part too. And to say about something to say about the whole jury like disregard all this is that I think it's always been interesting to me how people do that in trials, how they'll try and throw something in, and this is definitely more common, way more common in movies than in real life, because you get in trouble for doing stuff like that if you do it too much in real life. But just trying to get evidence, or let the jury know about something that is strictly forbidden from them supposed to able to know about it. And then I've always thought what's interesting about this is I always thought like if I was on the jury, how can you just ignore that? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you know when you're back there, you know obviously everyone's going to say, "Hey, we can't consider that," but at the same time, it's impossible to just erase it from your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and there's also this didn't happen in the movie, but sometimes evidence will, before the trial happens, evidence will be, they'll say, okay, you are not allowed to use this piece of evidence in trial for whatever reason. And if you do somehow get it in there, you can, the trial will become a mistrial. It'll end because now the jury knows about it. And you know the court or the court obviously knows that the jury's not going to forget that, and that's something that the court system tries as hard as they can to prevent. And that's another reason they are so thorough with jury selection because they're trying to get oftentimes like the first people they're trying to weed out are people that have heard about the case or have really big biases one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you very. That is like the the precipice of jury selection is just trying to weed out someone who has a very noticeable, and then you can kind of drill down to try to get like characteristics that you think would ingratiate themselves to your side. But yeah, like you said, I mean, from my very media kind of inspired knowledge of that, that is something that comes up time and time again. I mean, it's the first things that they ask. Have you heard about it? Do you have any prejudices? So on and so forth. But and it speaks to kind of the perfect storm of this entire story where the judge seemingly doesn't want to have to re-deal with this entire case. So and he completely admits fault but doesn't say, hey, look, this is a mistrial. And also the people on the defense, I think there is that realization that now that it has been uncovered, whether it's Newman, Paul Newman, or another lawyer, I mean, the cat's out of the bag, and that crucial piece of information will be, brought to the surface if this has to be retried. And from my understanding, wouldn't that piece of evidence have to be admitted prior to the trial actually going to court? Like they would have to say, look, this is a vital piece of information so they can both review and then prepare for it.
Exactly. Yes, that is true. That's why, you know, it's funny because and I don't think I've seen a legal movie where they don't do the whole surprise witness thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is yeah, that's similar to evidence. The judge has to know who's coming in as a witness beforehand, just like they have to know what evidence is going to be admitted. And both parties have to be aware.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can see, especially now that you point everything out, I can definitely see the inconsistencies. Um, it does make for a very much more interesting story, obviously, to have the dramatic reveals. But I want to ask you, Matt, any kind of additional points that you want to bring up and discuss?
Um, hmm. No, I think I said about everything I wanted to say just about, you know, the whole legal process and all that in general. I have to say that, um, you know, I've seen a quite a lot of legal movies at this point. I would say this is definitely a good one. One I like more is called, but it's less about a trial and it's more about I would say like it would be like if this movie was a little more focused on Paul Newman as a character. But it's called Primal Fear, and
Mm,
Edward Norton is in it. Very good legal movie. It's not just focused on a trial.
I've heard about that movie. I've yet to see it. I know Richard Gere, and damn, I'm gonna forget his name. He's in Fight Club. Oh, you said his name, Edward Norton. Um,
Hmm.
and it's a like a people praise his performance in that one very heavily. They say Edward Norton like steals the show. So I want to watch that one pretty badly.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. But I just watching legal movies in general now that I'm a lawyer has completely changed my perspective. And if I went back and watched like one of my favorite shows when I was really young, Law and Order, would probably see it completely differently too.
Matt, let me ask you, what did you rate this film?
So at first I gave it 3.5, and then as I the legal stuff sat with me and made me rate it a 3, and then I brought it back. So I've determined that I'm just in the middle somewhere between 3 and 3.5.
I gotcha. And I'm like right there in the mix with you. I gave it a 3.5. Um, it was Paul Newman's acting, like, and I think you said this prior to us recording. It's the character study aspect of his character in this that really it won the day for me. But I have to say, when there is something that I feel semi knowledgeable about, and there's just like complete like missteps in the actual procedure of it, I get like it really rubs me the wrong way. Um,
You can't help it, you know.
and like here's one, and this is like just a taste of it. Like your knowledge on law is a lot more than my knowledge of like football, but I really enjoy football and kind of like have a semi understanding. There's a movie, it has Kevin Costner in it where he plays a GM, and they just tell this story about him making the most ludicrous moves prior to the draft, and I think that's the name of the movie. And then it ends up all working out for him in the end. And my girlfriend loves that movie. She knows a lot about football too, which makes me like surprised she liked it. And we have this argument. I'm like, it's such a stupid movie. It's like none of this would ever work. Um, but just speaking to your point, like I understand how that can impact your enjoyment as you're watching it.
Yeah, yeah. It was just like during it, I was thinking they can't do this, stuff like that, you know. But then I have to think, okay, it's a movie, stuff like that.
Exactly. Wrapping it up, Sidney Lumet, like as a director, what are your kind of thoughts and feelings about him? At this point, I've got to see the first movie that he debuted with, the last movie that he has made as of now, and then a lot of his really good movies kind of in the middle of his career. And I do have to say I'm quite impressed with the longevity. I know a lot of people are just looking at his letterbox. He definitely has as many misses as hits, but um, there's still something to be said for someone who can make great movies over and over again. I mean, maybe he only gets past the bar of great a few times, but still a director I admire at least and has made some really great ones.
Yeah, my thoughts, he's one of those directors that he like his films are very diverse. Like a lot of times you talk about directors on here and you'd say like there's some kind of auteur aspect. Like there's a theme, like, Peck and Paws, likes to make movies about violence. It seems like he doesn't like he's very diverse, and his movies like hit in a way that's able to like resonate with popular audiences, which is like only very few directors can do that. Like I was just looking through like his top three movies, 12 Angry Men, Network, and Dog Day Afternoon. And I mean, they're all on a letterbox average rating above 4 stars. And then you like keep going down. I mean, Serpico's like about four. The Verdict's about four. I mean, he's made so many great films that just are able to resonate across the board. So he's one of those um, directors with the mass appeal that that clearly has like I'd say a command of like the movie making craft, what like just the craft of actually making a film and a one that people will enjoy. So he can, he could sell tickets, but at the same time, the movies are there's more to them maybe than just uh, what's surface level.
I agree, and I'm glad you mentioned Network because I had completely forgotten he made that film, and it's honestly, it's really weird to think the same director who made that film made both The Verdict and 12 Angry Men because it feels completely different than those films. And Dog Day Afternoon is the same way. Serpico is the same way. Now, 12 Angry Men, The Verdict, and maybe Serpico, they do feel more close in tone and obviously subject matter, but he is diverse. And Before the Devil Knows You're Gone, that one feels completely different than all of those films too. So, uh, it's what I find is people always say it's difficult for directors to evolve, but it seemed like he was able to do so to some success for sure.
Yeah, it's one other thing I'll say, now that I was thinking about how all those movies could be similar, is they're not just about like justice, they're about like systems of maybe like social systems, like justice systems, and how, they can be corrupt.
Mm.
Like Network maybe like about the news system. Serpico may be more lines like the police force, same with Dog Day Afternoon. So it's a lot. It's kind of like focused on maybe a legal subject matter, like broadly, but it's a lot about, corruption of the systems that we have in place.
Which is I guess it to an extent I was gonna say originally coming from his time period, a director coming up in the 50s, uh, that surprising because I do think generally there was a trust of the establishment in the 50s that you don't see in the 60s and 70s, but an astute viewer during that time period, I believe McCarthyism or like the suspicion of communism, depending on your look of what justice is, that could bleed into kind of his whole thought processes and kind of lead him on a path, and as that evolves during the time period, becomes more emboldened in that stance of kind of mistrust against the establishments at play. So it was really interesting to see him have that through line throughout his career.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I was thinking Dog Day Afternoon is definitely about that too.
Yeah. Well, any additional thoughts you want to say in closing, Matt?
Um, I guess, 12 Angry Men specifically, I would say like top three or top two legal movies I've seen. So, if you're interested in that, check it out. But I think this is a good director that it's one of those that I always say, I would watch his films with friends and they would still enjoy them. This is a types of movies you could watch with a group of people, and it wouldn't be like, oh, it's like a even though it's artistic in its own right, it's not too far gone to where it can't be enjoyed by a popular audience.
I agree. I think it's very accessible, um, and that's especially because a lot of people are kind of turned off by black and white in a mostly dialogue film, but it has enough meat on the bone for people to really like it, and obviously it's a very understandable story too.
Yeah, yeah.
Matt, I want to say thank you for talking about this, man. This was a great conversation. Uh, I loved every minute of it. So thank you very much for joining me, man.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking about, something I was a little pretty familiar with, the crossover with a movie. The legal systems could be pretty interesting. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We'll have to do this again. Off the top of my head, I don't know any lawyer that not any lawyer, any director that has two law films, but I do love legal procedure films, and that's why I was like really happy to jump at these two. But definitely something we should do again, because having your expertise on the matter is always like it's very very illuminating, and I think the majority of audiences don't have much of a clue of a lot of the stuff that you realize, a lot, especially when it comes to kind of plot holes and stuff like that, or inconsistencies with what is truly legal and not.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I only know it because I've been in law school. This is not the kind of stuff, unless you just study law for fun, that I think any normal viewer would know. So,
Absolutely. Well, Matt, you've been great. That is all from us. Thank you for joining us, and we will catch you on the Flippity Floop. Bye, y'all.